everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today we're going to be discussing Blue-Red in Bloomburrow. As always, the notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. Blue-Red is the worst performing color pair in Bloomburrow, and the third least drafted pair, but it's, pretty similar to the other not very popular decks. And there's not a clean solution to this. There aren't as many cheap creatures that you'd like to play as the deck wants, and you want a high spell count, but I think the nature of the format is such that most of the spells that are available have somewhat polarized matchups. It's not terrible, but there are certainly some cards that are much better against some of the faster decks with small creatures or some of the slower decks, and it can be difficult to find the exact right balance. And if you have too much removal, you can struggle against the decks that make a lot of tokens or have a lot of good enter the battlefield abilities. So Blue-Red is in a bit of a tough spot. I don't think the deck is unplayable. This isn't a case of a strictly failed archetype or anything, and I do think the deck is largely supposed to do what it tells you to, with the note that otters are less essential than the spells. This is a spell slinger archetype, one where you want a high spell count, and most of the cards that fit in that most of the creatures that fit in that do happen to be otters, I suppose, but a lot of the otters aren't that good anyway, and the creature support's not as good, especially at common, as one might want. To that end, I think the most important thing when drafting Blue-Red is actually just to minimize the number of common creatures in your deck. Lightshell Duo, the blue 3/3/4 with prowess that surveils 2 on ETB. Alania's Pathmaker, the 3 and a red 4/2 that exiles the top card of your library and you can play it until the end of your next turn. And Tempest Angler, the blue-red 1 hybrid 2/2 that gets a +1/+1 counter on it when you cast an instant or sorcery. All perform decently. None of them are exceptional. They're basically all worse than most of the uncommon creatures. But all of those three are playable, and you basically want to avoid anything else. It's not a disaster if you have to play a couple of common creatures, but for the most part, you would always rather have an interactive spell at common, a common interactive spell or an uncommon creature, than any of the common creatures, either the 3 listed or any of the others. There are a lot of just blue-red creatures that are just kind of very slightly below rate and seem like, I guess, the kind of thing that reads to me as a core set creature. A creature that's not going to have any particular synergies in your deck. It's just going to be about, a 3/4 or a 3/3 with an ability, or a 3/4 with an ability, or I don't know. There are a lot of just generic 3 and 4 mana creatures that you could put in your deck that you probably shouldn't. And then there are a lot of 2 mana creatures that you would like to be able to put in your deck, but they're just not really quite good enough. I think the Whisker Quill Scribe, the 2/2 for 1 and a red that rummages when you target it, is the kind of card that would be a better fit than most. You want 2-drops, and rummaging is very good, but you don't really want to play very many things that target your own creatures, so that would be the sort of thing where I would try not to play it, but if I end up needing to, I wouldn't be terribly unhappy about it. There are a lot of higher rarity cards that perform quite well. So as long as you're avoiding the commons and finding uncommon and rare creatures, you should be fine to be able to like finish a game. Most blue-red decks that trophy, like a vast majority, play between 8 and 12 creatures. I think that that's a reasonable number to expect to be able to find from just among the best common creatures and uncommon and rare creatures. Sometimes you'll be able to do it entirely with uncommon and rare creatures. I think if you have fewer than that, you really risk not being able to kill your opponent before you deck yourself. And if you have more than that, you're not going to get a lot of your like spell synergy and stuff like that. So I would say like it's also just hard to get to more than 12 creatures without playing a lot of the creatures that you probably shouldn't be playing. The best uncommon creatures, well, a lot of the best uncommon creatures like Shoreline Looter, the 1 and a blue 1/1 that is unblockable and loots when it damages your opponent, and then if you have Threshold, you don't need to discard a card, it just draws a card. Daring Wave Rider, the 4 blue 4/4 that casts an instant or sorcery with mana value 4 or less from your graveyard when it enters the battlefield. And Eddie Merc Crab, the 7 mana 5/5 that you can flash and taps 2 creatures, and if you play it not during your main phase, then it enters tapped. All of those care about your graveyard, so consider leaning into that. You don't really need to, because the thing about playing like removal and card draw spells is that they just naturally extend the game and go to the graveyard. And so you don't need to work a lot to enable your graveyard, but I think it's part of why Lightshell Duo, for example, performs well. And the more of that stuff you have, the more you might want to start playing stuff like Sazakap's Brew, the Tormenting Voice variant. As an example of like what I'm saying in terms of prioritizing instant and sorcery commons over creature commons, Conduct Electricity is a card that I've largely avoided, but it's actually playable in blue-red and performs better than any common creature. So that's the 5 mana deal 6 and deal 2 to a token creature. Again, that has better stats, like a better win rate, than every single common creature, and I think it's like a borderline instant sorcery. I believe that there are kind of like 2 different approaches to blue-red. There's an aggressive prowess heavy build that I think uses Tempest Angler well and pairs that well with cards like Shore Up and Might of the Meek and Sazakap's Brew. And then that really likes if you can get some of the higher rarity, cheaper prowess otter cards like Storm Chaser's Talent. That's the rare that makes prowess otter for blue and then levels up. Also the 1 mana 1/1 haste uncommon prowess otter that makes your spells cost less, and Otterball Antics, the sorcery with flashback that makes a 1/1 prowess otter. All of those cards help with the aggressive builds. If you have more shore ups and Might of the Meeks, you can kind of transition into playing some more mouse stuff and getting some value out of Valiant. There you can start playing stuff like Hearthfire Hero. And then as you start to play more of those, the red 3/2 Trample Duo becomes a reasonable consideration to target your Valiant creatures. So that takes you in a bit of a different direction. I think that the most common blue-red decks are more in the removal, card draw, and then creatures that are just like big and can kind of win a game if you trade off a bunch of resources and keep them. So creatures like Shoreline Looter, Daring Wave Rider, Eddie Merc Crab, and Quake Tusk Boar. Quake Tusk Boar is the 3 red 5/5 haste trample. And then also, I guess, Night Fisher, the 5 mana 4/5 flyer that makes a 1/1 fish when you play a bird. Not that I would expect to cast a lot of birds, but 5 mana for a 4/5 flyer is a reasonable top end for the kind of more controlling card draw and removal based blue-red decks. Kindle Spark Duo, the Lizard Otter, 2 and a red for a 1/3 that taps to do a damage to your opponent and untaps when you play an instant or sorcery, is the most overplayed card in blue-red. Like, as far as card, like, it's very highly played and has very bad stats. I think that there are some times when it's playable, especially if you have Valley Flame Color, the rare 3/3 that makes your lizards, otters, raccoons, and mice do an extra damage, so that it's doubling the damage you're getting from your Kindle Spark duo. Like, that's a good combo. And it's reasonable in some of the aggressive decks, but I think that it doesn't have enough impact on the battlefield for the more controlling decks, and I think it's a little on the slow side for the more aggressive decks. So I think it's just a little bit awkward all around. It can be decent, if your deck is pressuring your opponent and you think that it matters that it can win outside of combat, but for the most part, I don't think it's what most of the blue and red decks are looking for. Another example of a card that you want to avoid, Run Away Together, the 1 in a blue common that bounces one of your creatures and one of your opponent's creatures. I like this card a lot in some decks, especially frogs, but it's very hard to construct a blue-red deck that wants it because your creature count is low, your creatures tend to cost more mana on average, and your creatures are less likely to have ETB abilities unless they're creatures that cost a lot of mana. So you should really be just avoiding Run Away Together. Cards that go late that you should look for: Pearl of Wisdom, the 2 in a blue draw 2 that costs 1 less if you have an otter. Dire Downdraft, the 3 in a blue, put a creature on top or bottom of its owner's library that costs 1 less if the creature is attacking or tapped or blocking. Calamitous Tide, the 6 mana, draw 2, discard a card, bounce up to 2 creatures, sorcery. Into the Floodmaw, the 1 mana bounce spell that you can gift a fish to bounce a non-creature, but it only bounces your opponent's stuff instant. And Daring Wave Rider. All of those perform pretty well and are taken later than 6th pick on average. And that's most of what I have to talk about. With very, very large swaths of cards that you don't want to play, it makes the draft pretty straightforward, just because you're choosing from a relatively small set of playable cards. I think that blue-red, especially in this controlling space, can splash. I think that you're mostly looking to splash more instant sorceries and uncommon and more rare creatures. You're looking for kind of built-in card advantage on your creatures, and you're looking for just more good rate hard removal spells if you're splashing. And again, to reiterate, the biggest piece of advice is, when in doubt, take a common instant or sorcery over a common creature. That's not to say that you should take literally all blue and red instant or sorcery commons over all blue and red creature commons, but it's really, really, really close to that, and if there's any doubt, it would be safest to err that way. One other note from my experience drafting, trying to follow this advice right before this podcast, I did have a deck that followed this, played very few creatures, and had a lot of card draw, largely because I ended up with 3 Calamitous Tides, and I did deck myself. And after that happened, I added a Barkform Harvester, and I won a game after drawing through my entire original library, in which I didn't get to the full loop my deck stage where I have a Harvester and an empty library, but I played a Harvester, it was killed, and in response, I put a bunch of good cards from my graveyard on the bottom of my deck and ended up winning with those cards. So there is some chance that you want to consider Barkform Harvester, but I would not prioritize it. I would not take it over any of the common creatures I talked about. I would generally not play it, and I would generally hope to find enough high-impact, uncommon creatures that you don't need it. But if you do end up heavy on Shoreline Looter and other good card draw, and light on crabs and boars and wave riders and night fishers and stuff, consider Barkform Harvester as a way to avoid decking yourself. If you are heavier on prowess or splashing, consider highly prioritizing Fountainport Bell as a way to get a prowess trigger and fix your mana, and also put a card in your graveyard for your Shoreline Looters. That's most of what I have to say about Blue-Red. So I'm going to turn it over to chat for questions. I want to thank the newest patron. So Robert, thank you for your support. And if anyone else is interested in supporting the podcast, check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes to do that, or evaluate the offerings for patrons to decide if you want to do it. I mentioned Valley Flamecaller with Kindlespark Duo. Valley Floodcaller does essentially the same thing in a different way. That's true. Both of them result in an extra damage on each spell that you cast. Flamecaller by making it deal more damage when it taps, and Floodcaller by letting it tap an extra time. That means if you have both of them, you're doing 4 times as much damage, whereas if you have 2 of either of them, you're doing 3 times as much damage. So if you are collar flooded, that's a thing to think about. Are you able to call out some off-color commons or uncommons that you're often interested in splashing in blue-red, which people might not be aware of? Not really. Like I said, it's really just like the creatures that are like splashable and have ETB abilities, like Downwind Ambusher, and then hard removal like Fell, and the Repel, the 1 and a white kill a big thing. That sort of card. Nothing like too like weird or surprising. Any thoughts to splashing green-black in blue-red and dropping the blue and red cards? I do think that that would work pretty well, though I wouldn't really consider it a splash if you've dropped all the blue and red cards. Some very good players are saying blue-red is the best archetype. Do you think it's just very hard to draft? I will say that I was curious about that and checked the stats for top players to see if blue-red had a better win rate among top players, and it doesn't. It does move from the worst performing to barely better than blue-white, the second worst performing, but still considerably behind all the other decks among top players. I think that blue-red, like, these are the least drafted colors. It is relatively safe to expect them to be open. And I do think that there is, certainly room to perform better than average by having a good sense of what you're looking for. And I think that, in particular, you want like a lot of take out the trash and then some of these like good uncommon creatures. I still think that gets it up to playable. I don't really believe that it's the best archetype is a strange claim to make for a deck that I think even the people who succeeded drafting it probably know that they're succeeding because it's underdrafted, and that if everyone else were also drafting it, they wouldn't do well with it or want to draft it. I think there are times when you can expect it to be well enough positioned that it would make sense for it to be something you're looking for, keeping an eye out for, maybe even your go-to. But it's a difficult archetype to claim in any real, coherent way is just, the best archetype in the set. in terms of archetypes within best of 1 or best of 3, could this blue-red be better since you have a toolbox sideboard? Yeah, I do. I didn't look at the stats on like blue-red and traditional versus best of 1, and honestly, I don't know how much that would matter. I know that, like, for example, when I'm playing traditional drafts on Arena, I'm often pretty lazy about sideboarding. Not always, but often. So I do think that there's a very real chance that blue-red could perform better in best of 3, both because of access to the sideboard, and also I think that like the hand smoother is not doing any blue-red any favors relative to other decks. So I think that, yeah, there's certainly reasonable reasons to consider the possibility that blue-red could perform better in best of 3. If you prefer playing best of 3, you're playing on Magic Online, or you're playing in paper events, I would be a little bit more willing to draft blue-red, but it wouldn't change how I'm prioritizing things. You mentioned staying away from Runaway Together. I've actually liked it a decent amount when I have an Eddy Mark crab or two. Yeah, I understand the interaction you're looking for, where you get to like crab a whole bunch of creatures. That doesn't sound like a thing that I would want to draft expecting to happen. Like, your blue-red deck is usually looking to have a lot of spells, especially if you have Eddy Mark Crab, which means that you're often just going to be like trading your removal spells for your opponent's creatures. So like, it's weird to imagine this spot where your opponent has like a lot of creatures and you want to like tap them all down with an Eddy Mark Crab, and then that's going to let you get a bunch of creatures through. And like, in that spot, it sounds like you probably got there because you have like Tempest Angler and some other big creatures that are holding your opponent off, which is to say that it doesn't really sound like there are any creatures in your deck that you really want to cast Runaway Together targeting other than the crab. So, like, this sounds like it's trying to optimize for the games where you've already successfully cast Eddy Mark Crab, and I just feel like those are the games that are going well anyway, and a card that could be cast before the crab would generally serve the deck better overall. What are your thoughts on Gossip's Talent in blue-red? I would not want to play Gossip's Talent in blue-red. Again, I think that you want a pretty low creature count, which means that the first mode of it isn't going to trigger all that many times. You're playing a lot of removal, which means that the evasion mode isn't doing that much because your opponent is less likely to have as many creatures, and you shouldn't really be prioritizing the like creatures that would go in frogs, like that kind of ETB creature, very highly. You're really like, your ETB creatures are really just like your big creatures that, you know, if you've cast them and they're staying around, you're in pretty good shape. I'm not going to claim that that it's impossible to ever have blue and red cards in your deck and want Gossip's Talent, but I would suspect a vast majority of blue-red decks should avoid Gossip's Talent. I think if you're playing it just to surveil a few times, you would be better off playing basically any other card instead. How do you think about the right amount of lands to play in blue-red decks? That's a reasonable question. These are decks that are trading resources a lot, and so they could certainly flood out, or they could certainly benefit from like drawing fewer lands later. So I think it's reasonable to consider trying to like decrease your land count on the one hand. On the other hand, you're trying to play a lot of like expensive finishers like Quake-Tusk Boar and Daring Wave Rider that really like want you to hit your 5th and 6th land on time. So I think that my preferred approach is to play like 17 lands plus spells, and then just have some way to like draw enough extra cards or rummage to like make up for like drawing lands in the mid to late game. But if you're heavy on cheap removal and a little bit lighter on top end, I think it's very reasonable to cut a land or two. Also, honestly, I keep finding that in this format in general, I kind of like to err a little bit lower on lands. Like, I've started to, trim some number of lands when I have Cash Grab in my deck, and I find that flooding out can be a pretty serious issue with a lot of my decks. So I wouldn't mind leaning further into experimenting with slightly lower land counts, provided I have a good amount of like 2 and 3 mana removal spells. Especially, the blue red deck is not, it's not important to curve out, it's only important not to fall behind. So as long as you have enough answers that, like, it's not important that you cast a Quake Tusk Boar on turn 5 if the board is empty. Like, if you just have a bunch of removal spells and you need to cast this eventually to kill your opponent before you deck yourself, it really doesn't matter which turn that's happening on. So the more like 1-for-1 removal you have, the more it makes sense to like cut your land count, as long as all of your 1-for-1 removal is cheap enough that you can reliably cast it. And it helps to also have some card draw to help make your land drops. But then again, it gets like, there's a big difference between Pearl of Wisdom and the 5 mana draw 3 in terms of how much they make me want to think about decreasing my land count. Like, Pearl of Wisdom, I can plan to use to hit my 4th and 5th land drops, whereas I need to play enough lands to naturally hit my 5th land drop to play a 5 mana draw 3, and in that case, I wouldn't want to play fewer lands. So it's going to depend a lot on your specific spell composition, but I think that you should certainly consider you should not always play 17 lands in blue-red. And there are versions of blue-red that can have expensive spells and want lower land counts, and versions that can have cheap spells and want higher land counts. It really depends on how much removal you have, and even more than that, how much mana your card draw spells cost. If your card draw spells cost 3 or fewer, you can cut lands. If they cost 5 or more, you want to add lands. If they cost 4, maybe stay at around 17. All right, so I'm going to wrap it up there. The important notes are, again, there are multiple different approaches to blue-red, but I think they kind of all or most want to prominently feature spells, and then it's kind of just like what support you have for those spells and which spells you have that can dictate whether you're more like play spells first, then play creatures is kind of the control deck model where you have cheap removal and big finishers, or play creatures first, then play spells is kind of the like prowess tempo model. So you want to figure out like if you're firmly one or the other of those and modify your card choices appropriately. And outside of that, I think that blue-red is playable as kind of a way to exploit how underplayed each of these colors and the colors together are. And it's also noteworthy that when blue and red are played individually, I think both of them want significantly different blue and red cards most of the time than the blue-red deck where you're playing blue and red together want. So I think that this is going to be an open color combination more often than most other color combinations, and from everything I've heard, there are players who have gravitated toward looking to end up here and been relatively happy with it. So this is an interesting space for kind of a worst deck to be, where it, doesn't perform well in aggregate, and I do think it's, the cards are relatively weak and undersupported, but there is some room to take advantage of how open it is and to have success if you, draft it well and get the right stuff, reportedly. So an interesting archetype, even if it's a little bit difficult. I've been having some fun exploring it today, even if I don't feel like I have it quite to the point where I think it would be one of my best performing archetypes personally. So definitely something that I'm looking to experiment with a little bit more still. And that's it. So thanks for listening. Have a good week. And I will be back next week as usual. Bye for now.
Prepare for light speed.